Next up this morning, we get the honour of hearing from Mr. Antony Loewenstein, who's both a journalist and an author. He's written for the New York Times, The Guardian, the BBC, the Washington Post, and many others. He's the author of several books, and his latest one is called Pills, Powder and Smoke, Inside the Bloody War on Drugs. He's a writer and co-producer of the documentary Disaster Capitalism and co-director of an Al Jazeera English film on the opioid drug tramadol. Plenty of best-selling books. Could you welcome Antony to the stage?
Thank you so much. I'm really honoured and rapt to be here because so many of the speakers that I've been hearing and reading about come from this issue in some ways from a different perspective. I'm a journalist, so I don't work with people who are addicted, although I spend a lot of time with people around the world who are. I want to give people a bit of a sense of the work I've done around these questions, both in Australia and globally, and then give some ideas and prescriptions, some of which you will have heard before, some of which maybe you have not. And why I think these questions are so important is that I feel that the reason I wrote this book, Pills, Powder and Smoke, which came out recently, is really to challenge so many of the ideas about the drug war. The reason I started writing it about 5 years ago was quite simple. I felt and worried that too many people in Australia and around the world thought that the drug war was something that happened in the past. It was over. It happened decades ago. It happened when we would see programs on Netflix about narcos or Pablo Escobar. This is something that was in the past. And people also, I think, believed mistakenly that because many US states, for example, and countries were now legalising cannabis, that there was inevitability about the drug war ending. And one my book tries to argue and show by travelling around the world to many countries, and I'll get to those details in a minute, is in fact that that's a complete myth. The drug war has arguably never been more violent and more destructive and more appalling for people's lives. And the reason for that is very clear. Demand for illicit drugs has never been higher. Full stop. Around the world. I'm talking about drugs such as cannabis, where it's illegal still, cocaine and other drugs. Demand has never been higher. And the reason for that is, we can go into it some other time, but the effect of that around the world is so many people need to provide and supply those drugs for those of us in the West who use it. And the reason it's important to talk about that is that too often, I think, in the Western media coverage, when we talk about drugs and drug use and drug abuse, we're ignoring the fact that vast people and countries around the world are being destroyed because of our desire for drugs. One of the points I was interested in trying to investigate by travelling around the world, and I'll get to some of those details in a minute, was to sort of say, why is there so much demand for illicit substances? Why is this happening? I think that's obviously a question many of you people in mental health can answer maybe better than me. But one of the things that I found constantly was that there is still so much shame and trauma around people who do use drugs, which to me is profoundly problematic. And often those of us in the media contribute to that shaming. And one of the things I tried to do in my book and a lot of my work is to try to both challenge and change the ways in which many of us in the media report about these questions. Now, simply changing the language that we use doesn't change the shame around drug use. It's obviously more complicated than that, but it's important. And one of the things I think was also key for me, the sort of journalism I've always done over the years, I've been a journalist for about 15 years now, is to look at people from the ground up rather from top down. And what that means is that too much of journalism, in my view, both in Australia and around the world, although they claim does not want to be close to power, likes the idea of working alongside power. And what that means is that a lot of journalism that you see every day, and this is across the media, not just Murdoch Press, ABC, much of media, is essentially what we call like a sanctioned leak. Journalist X gets a piece of information, a press release, something from a politician or an advisor, and that's published as news, so-called news. That to me is not journalism, it's basically stenography. And the problem with that is that too much of two things that contributes to. A, if one looks at public opinion polls about how many people in the public view journalists, we are close to the bottom. And that to me is mostly warranted. Now, there are good journalists, hopefully me amongst others, and they're not all bad. But I do think that there is an important point that the reason a lot of people in the general public have contempt for journalism and media in general, there's a reason for that. It doesn't suddenly come out of nowhere. Where does that come from? Why are so many people distrustful and arguably contemptible towards journalism? So for me, over the years, it's been trying to challenge that and say there's a way to do journalism differently. If it comes to the drug war, the war in the Middle East, I spent time in Afghanistan. I wanted to challenge that by speaking to those who are, for example, victims, speaking to people caught in the middle, people who are often impacted negatively by those in power, and giving them a voice. So the idea of this book was to spend about 5 years travelling around the world. Let me give you a taste of where I went. This is not in particular order. I went to Honduras, a country close to the US. And Honduras is, for those who don't know, a place where in the last 5 or 10 years, the vast bulk of cocaine going into the US goes via Honduras. Honduras is a narco state which has been controlled by various US-backed forces for years. And the impact of what a narco state means is that every level of government in some way is controlled or influenced or financed or bullied by narcos, mostly in South and Latin America. And what that means for people on the ground in Honduras is complete devastation. I've now never been to a country where virtually everyone you meet wants to leave. And they're not leaving because they're dying to travel a long, long way to try to get into the US. They're dying to leave because life is so intolerable. And why is that? Because so many people in the US, for example, are desperate to get cocaine. Where does that cocaine come from? Principally 3 countries: Colombia, Peru, Bolivia. 90% of the world's cocaine comes from one country, Colombia. It's been the case for years. And despite the fact that 6 years ago there was a so-called peace deal between the government and the FARC, the rebel group that's been fighting for half a century, cocaine production has never been higher in Colombia. And why is that? Because demand for cocaine has never been higher, including here in Australia. And cocaine in Australia will cost anywhere between $300 to $400 a gram. In Colombia, it costs $5 US. And the impact of that supply chain around the world is profound. And the people on the ground who are impacted by it, particularly in places like Colombia, Honduras and elsewhere, is so detrimental that I would argue, as I'll get to in a minute, that there needs to be a fundamentally different way that we view and see drug use and abuse. I spent time in Guinea-Bissau, which is a tiny country that virtually no one's ever heard of, in West Africa on the coast. And in the last 10 or 15 years, so much of the cocaine going into Europe goes via this one country. It's a cocaine transit country. Again, it's a narco state. How does that work? Cocaine is shipped on large ships from South America, goes into west coast of Africa, and then gets taken up by various militant groups up to Europe and then across Europe and then into the UK. And the impact of something like that in Guinea-Bissau or countries like that, Ivory Coast and others, are states that are crumbling. They're not as violent as, say, Mexico or Honduras, thankfully, but they are narco states, again, meaning that the demand for drugs and cocaine particularly is so high in places like Europe and the UK that these drugs have to get to people somehow. And one of the things that I try to talk about in the book is in the last years, there's been so much focus in much of the West about caring about where we get our food from, where we get our clothes from. We think about that, as many of us rightly should, the human rights negative impacts on how we consume goods and what we eat. But how often are we thinking about ethical drugs? How often are we thinking about the idea that where are we getting, assuming maybe not in this room, but I'm sure some people do, use illicit substances, why are we not thinking about the ethical way of doing so? And that to me means legalising drugs, which I'll get to in a moment. The Philippines is another place I went to, and many people in this room will be aware of what's been happening there, but let me give you a brief summary. The Philippines had a new president in 2016 called Rodrigo Duterte, who in the last 6 years has essentially, through his police force, killed anywhere between 25 to 40,000 Filipinos in cold blood. These are people mostly in Manila. These are people who are mostly powerless, voiceless. And what was so disturbing about going there, and I wanted to spend time there for a particular reason, was to say, how is something like this so popular with so many people? Why are so many Filipino people who are voting, who had midterm elections a few years ago and he got increased majority, Why are so many people supporting those policies? Now, many people do not. I'm not saying everyone in the Philippines does. Of course, that's not true. But one thing that really came out in my reporting there, apart from obviously spending time with those whose families had been impacted, fathers had been killed, children had been killed in front of them in the worst slums of Manila, is the narrative that had been sold by many people in the Filipino government, which essentially said the only way we can solve the drug problem is essentially to kill our way out of it. Now that sounds extreme. It is extreme. But I would argue that narrative actually has far more potency in many people's imaginations in many countries than we like to accept. Now, I'm not suggesting Australia's about to adopt that or other countries, they're not. But in parts of Asia, you'd be surprised how willing other governments look at the Philippines and say, we could do that. We'd like to mimic that or copy that or get inspired by that. I see that in parts of Indonesia and elsewhere. And when Duterte's term ends next year in 2022, assuming he doesn't try to hold on to power, his police forces probably kill, as I said, up to maybe 40,000 Filipinos. And these are people who are, just to be very clear, have been either low-level drug users, possibly low-level drug dealers, people who are using something called shabu, which essentially is a drug that it's a very, very cheap drug, which gives you a brief high, essentially. And one thing that really came out very clearly to me, being in a place like that, which again challenges the myth about how we in the West report on drug use and abuse, is if you are living in a slum in Manila, it makes 110% sense you would be using drugs. It makes complete sense. And I don't mean that to say everyone should be using drugs. What I mean is that the economic and social realities in these places is so grim that taking drugs is the only arguably logical way to get through your day. And I saw that equally when I was in Nigeria a few years ago reporting for Al Jazeera about tramadol. Now, a lot of you will know tramadol. It's a legal drug available here, not over the counter, but by doctors. You might get it if you have severe pain. Women are often given it after childbirth. But what you're finding in other parts of the world, particularly in, say, Nigeria or elsewhere, is that there is a mass use of drugs like tramadol, and it's industrial strength grade tramadol, meaning that Indian pharmaceutical companies are making tramadol pills 3, 4, 5, 6 the times of normal strength. And you can buy these in shops on the sides of the road in Nigeria and elsewhere, and people often are taking 5, 6, 7, 10, 15 pills a day. Now, one pill won't kill you, but excessive use of these drugs will. And again, I think it's important, although this room, maybe I'm preaching to the converted about this question, but so much of the misunderstanding about drug use is shaming people who take drugs like tramadol. Now, having been in Nigeria, again, I'm not saying everyone should take tramadol. I'm saying that if you live in places that I went to in Nigeria, a woman I met, for example, was a sex worker who was seeing 15 to 20 men a day in the most vile slum area you can imagine. She was taking about 15 tramadol pills a day just to get through the day. And the way that the government and many international bodies view that is actually to demonise her rather than to try to address the reasons why she was taking the drug in the first place. And if someone like her did not take tramadol, as she said to us, my colleague and I, her day will be unbearable. And I think too often, whether it's in Nigeria, which feels like a long, long way away, or somewhere much closer, we, and I'm saying we as in we in the media, rather than we in this room, too often will demonise someone like her rather than actually explaining why she's using the drug in the first place. One other quick example about tramadol in Nigeria. A lot of militant groups like Boko Haram are using drugs like tramadol. When they kidnap young boys and girls, they're giving tramadol to them to brainwash them. And often when you see acts of vile terrorism in parts of Africa and for that matter beyond, you are seeing people, young people who are on these kinds of drugs. Drugs like tramadol and others can give you a high for 3 or 4 days when they're industrial strength. They give you kind of a sense of invincibility, and you don't sleep for 3 or 4 days. ISIS often were using these kinds of drugs as well for days in the Middle East. 3 other quick examples of where I went. I went to the US, UK and here, because I'm Australian. And the reason I wanted to go to these 3 countries was to, I guess, A, see what I think are quite important shifts in how we're dealing with drug policy. But B, also to challenge this idea, as I touched on before, that somehow, because, for example, the US states are slowly legalising cannabis, that therefore there's an inevitability about a more progressive or open-minded drug policy. The UK, I'll start with that briefly first. The UK has the highest rate of cocaine use in Europe, the highest rate of cocaine deaths in Europe by far. Scotland has the highest rates of heroin overdoses in Europe by far. And you realise why that is when you're there. I spent time in the northeast of the UK a few years ago before COVID, and these are societies and communities that were arguably left to die decades ago during the Thatcher era. But in more recent terms, what austerity policies have done in places like that in the UK is drug services have essentially mostly stopped. Not entirely, but a lot. And the impact of that is that governments have made a choice, without saying it explicitly, that generations have been left to die. Not every single person, of course, is dying in a literal sense, but dying without opportunity. And the impact, I think, of that again shows that so much coverage in my industry, in the media, is to either ignore those people or demonise them. And again, I'm generalising. There are obviously exceptions to that rule. In the US, I wanted to examine the way in which cannabis is being legalised. I spent some time in some states where it has happened, and to see how potentially it could happen elsewhere. I think there's an inevitability about cannabis being legalised here, I'm saying for recreational use. It won't happen next week. It might not happen with the current Prime Minister we have, but it will happen, I think, almost certainly. But the way the US is doing it, in my view, is exactly the wrong way to do it. And let me briefly explain why. The US's policy of legalising cannabis is essentially mass commercialisation. Huge advertising, huge, I would argue, making drugs sexy, cannabis sexy. And the way, to me, you legalise cannabis or any drug is the aim is to make it as unsexy as possible. It's not even a word to desexify, but you make it as little sexy as possible. And the reason I say that is that's a really important point, because as we as a Western societies are undeniably moving towards places where, for example, cannabis will be legalised at some point here, 5 years, 10 years, who knows, soon. Psychedelics almost certainly will be legalised, at least for medicinal purposes, if not for wider use. So how we as a society view these drugs and how we choose to promote them or otherwise is vital to how they're viewed by the wider community. And I want to touch on a little bit about how we describe drugs language-wise, and I'm talking here about we in the media. Let me read you a short extract from the book. Before I began researching the war on drugs, I would casually and unthinkingly use the word addict to describe a person who used drugs excessively. But current thinking about drugs has forced me to challenge my thinking and biases. The Associated Press, for those who don't know, is one of the biggest news organisations in the world, updated its widely used AP-style book in 2017 to accommodate the new ideas. Addict would no longer be used as a noun. Instead, it said choose phrasing like he was addicted, people with heroin addiction, or he used drugs. John Kelly, an associate professor of psychiatry at Harvard University and founder and director of the Recovery Research Institute of the Massachusetts General Hospital, welcomed the move because he found in a 2010 study that doctors took a more punitive stand. This is doctors, not journalists. Doctors took a more punitive stand against patients who were described as substance abusers, as opposed to people with substance use disorder. This equally applied to the general public when reading stories in the press. Addiction researchers at the University of Pennsylvania in 2018 found that people in the general public, negatively when a person was described as an addict, alcoholic, or substance abuser. Terms that seem to label the person and invoke the negative attitudes towards the person rather than the disease, those are the ones that are the high levels of bias. And maybe in this room that's pretty obvious, but I would argue that many in the media, most in the media to this day, ignore all that. You still constantly see, whether it's in the so-called quality press or the crappy, less quality press, you're still seeing that same kind of language all the time. And I think it's dangerous and unnecessary, and I think journalists have a responsibility to change that. Let me just finally go because I want to take some questions. There is also, I think, an inevitability, as I said before, of the legalisation, at least for medicinal purposes, psychedelics. And there was a recent story in The Guardian about this. And I'm not just talking about patients who might be calling for it or wanting it. I'm talking about psychiatrists and doctors who are training in ways to use it with their patients. And this is a recent quote from Dr. Martin Williams, who's Executive Director of Psychedelic Research in Science and Medicine Incorporated, who recently told The Guardian, quote, "There's a cohort of psychiatrists and psychologists who have been frustrated by the demonstrable lack of positive outcomes for a certain proportion of the patients that they have. They've come to the conclusion that the current drugs, antidepressants and mood stabilizers and so forth, just don't work for everybody." Now, the ultimate question is, what does potentially legalization and regulation of all drugs look like? And he wasn't talking about that, but I am. And maybe for some people, this idea seems crazy, foreign, ridiculous, dangerous, add any word you'd like. And I'm not someone, to be clear, who says it should happen tomorrow. I don't think it's going to happen radically. I think it's likely to happen step by step rather than overnight. But I want to give a bit of a taste of what this sort of world could look like. And I want to quote from a recent book that came out by someone called Steve Rolls, who's one of the UK's most innovative drug reform writers. And he wrote a book about how you'd legalise stimulants meaning ecstasy, cocaine, etc. And this is what he wrote. MDMA, amphetamine pills or cocaine powder would be sold in single adult use doses in unbranded pharma-style packaging with clear content labelling and prominent health information and warnings. Products would only be available to adults over 18 with retail via dedicated pharmacy-style outlets staffed by licensed professionals with specialist training to offer health and safety information to customers. Retail outlets would be under the sole control of a dedicated government regulatory agency with no other retail permitted. The idea for what is effectively a state retail monopoly on drug sales is not a new one. It's already seen with alcohol sales in Sweden, for example, and recreational cannabis sales in a couple of Canadian provinces. The aim is to allow prioritisation of public health goals and removal of commercial profit incentives to initiate new users or increase use, learning from the grim history of unfettered alcohol and tobacco marketing. The regulatory agency would also license production activities, set prices, maintain strict quality controls, and enforce total bans on marketing and advertising. As I said before, any legalisation of drugs should have zero advertising. Like, think about how we now sell cigarettes in Australia. Yes, you can still buy them if you're over 18 and they're legal, though they're very expensive. There's no marketing, zero, which is exactly how it should be to me, whether you have cannabis or any other drug. And he concludes, state-run pharmacy-style outlets selling unbranded products with prominent health warnings may not seem like much fun, but we are looking to ensure that demand for drugs is not met in a way that optimises health and crime outcomes without promoting use. The focus is very much on managing the drug-using experience to minimise risks, rather than creating a shopping experience to maximise revenue. And with that, I'd love to take questions, if you have any. Thank you.
Thank you, Antony, for reminding us of the power of knowledge and language, and for doing the hard work you've done over many years to uncover and tell some of the truth about the hidden harms and traumas associated with drugs, and also for giving us some hope about ways that we could reduce that through legalisation. If we've got any questions from the floor, please come up to the microphone now, or you can type them in online. If you've got any questions for Antony.
Hey.
Hi.
So thanks for the talk, really enjoyable. My question is, you mentioned the US is kind of leading the way in legalizing at least cannabis, but you don't agree with, or you don't like the way that they're doing it. Did you spend any time, or do you know much about Portugal? I've heard anecdotally that they've got really good results. I think they're decriminalised. I'm not sure if they're legalised, but keen to hear your view.
I can. So Portugal in 2001 decriminalised all drugs, everything from cannabis to heroin to everything else. And they did that essentially because at the time they were suffering the worst HIV epidemic in Europe, and they decided they needed some radical solution. So decriminalisation was the answer, so they thought at the time. Now, 20 years on, I think the results are fairly startling in a positive way. On virtually all age groups, drug use has gone down, not entirely, but mostly. Drug abuse has gone down. Portugal has the country with the lowest rate of drug abuse in Europe, in Western Europe. Now, this doesn't suggest that Portugal is a utopia. There's still drug problems, there's still drug abuse. But one thing that the Portuguese government has done, over, I might add, successive years in both more liberal and conservative iterations, is that they have seen that if you spend far less money on police and law enforcement and much more money on healthcare, it actually works. What they've also done, crucially, which is something that I would encourage should happen here, but frankly doesn't, is drug education needs to happen early. Needs to start not at a teenager. In my view, it should happen when they're young kids. I'm not suggesting drug education means encouraging young people to take drugs. I mean, making in an informed way. In my view, it should start young, 5, 6, 7, young. Now, I've got young kids who are not even that age yet, but I think it should start very young. Because too often now, and Portugal, I think, has shown the fallacy of this argument, that too often now in Australia and a lot of other Western countries, it's still a version of just say no. It's a variety of just say no. Drugs are bad, drugs will kill you. And yes, drugs can kill you. I'm not denying any of that. But Portugal has shown a massive influx in support for educational opportunities, for better healthcare outcomes, and it's working. And it's remarkable to me how, in fact, there's no other country in the world that has mimicked exactly the same as Portugal. Portugal's a small country, so you couldn't copy it everywhere exactly. But the model there has been remarkably successful. And I'd encourage people, if they want to know more, to read up about it. There was actually an SPS Dateline program about it just last week, as it turns out, almost assessing how 20 years has been going. And the short answer is pretty damn well. So, yes, clearly still legalisation means that it's still illegal to buy drugs. And the way that works very briefly is you're allowed to have a small amount of drugs for personal use. Every drug is different, a handful of grams of cannabis, cocaine, whatever it may be. If you have more than that, you're regarded as maybe a dealer or something, and you can still be charged. But the key issue is removing people, the mass numbers of people that all Western countries now are obsessed with in the criminal justice system for small amounts of drug offences. Portugal has changed that. Yes, you can still be charged with drug offences if you have a large amount of drugs, but if you're a low-level drug user, you will not be charged. You're often taken to some kind of education and given maybe a warning. That to me is not just an enlightened way, but a sensible way to view drugs and drug use. So yeah, I very much commend people to, if they don't know about it, to look into Portugal. Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony. We've got a question online from Wendy. Can you offer any insight into the social policy that needs to surround the legalisation or decriminalisation of drug use? What would this look like?
Yeah, thank you for that. Look, as I said during my talk, I'm not arguing that we should legalise all drugs tomorrow. I don't think that's logical, sensible, obviously feasible at all. But what I think needs to happen is there needs to be a demystifying of what drug use is. The vast, vast majority of people who use drugs, over 90%, have no problems with them. You guys in this room know that better than me. The vast bulk of people who use illicit stuff, I'm talking about illicit drugs, have no problem. They're using it for whatever reason, recreational reasons, enjoyment, going out on a Saturday night, whatever. That to me is not the problem. It's the 5 or 10% of people who do, for a range of reasons, personal reasons, whatever it is. So to me, there needs to be a few things that are put in place, both social and political policy, to potentially move towards a more, in my view, enlightened drug policy. Without regulation and understanding that so many of the harms that are caused by drugs, not all of them, but think of the last few years of all these poor kids in New South Wales particularly, who were dying from bad ecstasy pills. That would not happen, at least in theory, in a legalised market. They're dying because they don't know what's in the drugs that they're taking. They're essentially being given, or they're taking drugs without having a clue what chemicals are inside them. A first step on this is, which is such a no-brainer, which should happen to me every single state, is pill testing everywhere. Should be mandatory, should be against the law in my view not to have pill testing. Pill testing, for those who don't know, means that at an event, a party, whatever it may be, someone can take their pill and get it checked if it's essentially okay or not. And if it's not, it's thrown away. And this works. I mean, in Europe, the evidence has been going for years. It's happening in parts of the US. It's happening in the ACT now for a couple of years. Obviously, COVID has slowed some of that down. But it's happening and it works. That to me is not just a social policy. It also says from a government and societal perspective that we respect people enough to care that they don't die. Because at the moment, the current policy, in my view, is essentially saying, we don't really care if you die. Unless you do something to address what drugs are getting into people's hands, you don't care that people are dying. When I say you, a government, not you in this room. And you see that when, for example, New South Wales Premier has had report after report in the last few years clearly saying that pill testing would save lives. Her response is to completely ignore it. That to me is not just shameful, it's irresponsible. It's insane. It's absolutely insane. And again, pill testing is a policy, but it's more than that. It says to me how we as society view people who use these substances, which is a lot. The use of ecstasy, by the way, has never been higher. It is very, very high amongst other stimulants. So social policy, I think, partly involves also making it seem, I mean, to me, it's about fundamentally shifting to sort of say drug use, illicit drug use, is not necessarily a bad thing. That doesn't mean you encourage it. I'm not arguing for encouragement. As I said before, the legalization means in regulation that nothing is made sexy. Everything is done quietly without any kind of promotion. And you see in the last few years the dangers of what advertising can do, because look in the last 10 years how, for example, vaping companies have made a fortune from people who are very young. Now, I would argue that vaping is mostly better than tobacco cigarette smoking, but vaping advertising shows young people looking kind of sexy vaping. It's exactly the wrong way to do this. It's exactly the wrong way to do it. So I think partly it's about having much more controls over advertising and marketing, which again is not the way the US is going down their path, and it's a mistake. And one thing finally about that is that in the US, which I didn't mention but I discuss it in my book, there needs to be an acknowledgement and reparations for the way in which the drug war had disproportionately affected people of colour. And you see this in many states now in the US that are legalising cannabis. Some, better than others, are trying to address this disparity. So if you're a person of colour or an African American who wants to enter the legal cannabis business, a previous conviction for that should not stop you doing so. And still in many states, people of colour find it unbelievably hard to get access to the legal cannabis market because of these previous convictions. And that needs to be changed, as it would here if it was legalised too.
Thanks, Antony. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. We could listen to you all day and there's questions waiting, I'm sure. But could you all join me in thanking Antony for his great insight this morning?